Hi and welcome to this video on the 1920s. In this video, we will provide an overview of the key events in the United States from the aftermath of the Great War to the 1929 Wall Street crash. Along the way, we'll examine race relations and the struggle for civil rights, immigration and labor issues, modernity, politics, and the economy. So let's get started. The course of the decade was set by a series of events which took place in 1918 and 1919. The most significant was the end of the First World War and the signing of the Treaty of Versailles on June 28, 1919. The war brought about a dramatic shift in the world's balance of power. The era of European dominance was at an end, as the continent's major powers were all irrevocably weakened by the conflict. America and Japan were the war's real winners. American banks and industry profited handsomely from the underwriting of the Allied war effort, while the Japanese, honoring the 1902 alliance with Britain, easily captured German colonies in Asia. The United States was a late entrant in the war, eventually siding with the Allies in 1917, but not actively joining the fight until the following spring. The American Expeditionary Force under the command of John J. Pershing ensured an Allied victory by November 1918. President Woodrow Wilson's ambitious vision for the post-war world suffered a major setback when the Senate rejected the Treaty of Versailles and refused to allow the United States to join the League of Nations. Worse was to come for Wilson in October 1919 when he suffered a stroke and was incapacitated for the remainder of his presidency. The lack of a decisive presence in the White House contributed to a climate of fear and uncertainty in the immediate post-war years. Two amendments also passed in this eventful year, the 18th and 19th Amendments. The 18th Amendment prohibited the manufacture and sale of alcohol. This seemingly extreme measure had already been in place in several states from 1917 and did not attract a great deal of controversy at the time. The 19th Amendment granted women the right to vote, a right that would soon be exercised in the 1920 presidential election. The election pitted the Republican candidate Ohio Senator Warren Harding against the Democratic candidate Ohio Governor James M. Cox. Harding's call for a return to normalcy resonated with an electorate weary of internationalism and the unrest at home. Harding's victory was emphatic. 37 states carried, and he received 60% of the popular vote. Harding was a likable, engaging figure. He was an exceptionally effective campaigner, but lacked foresight and made exceptionally poor choices in personnel once in office. The president fell ill and died suddenly on August 2, 1923, leaving Calvin Coolidge to become the sixth VP to ascend to the presidency. Silent Cal, as he was sometimes known, was most remarkable for being unremarkable. He cultivated a public image as a quiet and serious man with little appetite for sweeping changes. When it came to economic issues, he favored staying out of the way of business and lowering taxes, especially to the wealthy. He promised more of the same in the 1924 election, imploring voters to keep cool with Coolidge. He secured a full presidential term with a comfortable victory. The Coolidge administration oversaw the Indian Citizenship Act and Dawes Plan of 1924. The Indian Citizenship Act granted American citizenship to Native Americans partly in recognition of the major contribution made to the war effort in World War I, and the Dawes Plan helped bring Weimar Germany out of hyperinflation and stabilize the world's economy. While Coolidge held fairly progressive views on civil rights, he had little desire to get involved in the more controversial issues of the day. There were still racial tensions stemming from the Red Summer of 1919, a time that saw hundreds of casualties as a result of white supremacist terrorist attacks. An anti-lynching bill passed the House of Representatives in 1922, but was prevented from coming to a vote in the Senate by a filibuster by Southern Democrats. Membership of the Ku Klux Klan exploded in the early half of the 1920s, from a handful during the group's 1915 revival to up to 4 million by 1925. 30,000 Klansmen marched down Pennsylvania Avenue during the 1924 Democratic Convention in Washington. As well as acts of terror and intimidation against blacks across the country, the KKK was also fervently anti-Catholic and anti-Semitic. In fact, it was the latter two which proved a more effective rallying cry in some parts of the country. The Immigration Act passed in May 1924, greatly limiting immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe and effectively banning it from Asia. Looking back, immigration from Asia had long been the subject of restrictions and exclusions. The immigration of Chinese laborers was prevented by the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. The Gentlemen's Agreement between the United States and Japan in 1907 restricted immigration, and the 1917 Immigration Act banned any immigrants from India, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East. The 1924 Act was a progression of earlier measures in order to preserve the racial uniformity of the United States. Amid the political aspirations of the decade, 1920s America was also a time of great social and technological progress. Women began to take much greater control over their own lives and live independently. They ditched the constraints of the corset in favor of lighter clothes and shorter skirts. Short hair became very fashionable, and the cosmetics industry grew enormously. Unmarried women were far more likely to live alone and enter the workforce outside of the traditional occupations. It was not only young single women who enjoyed greater freedoms. An increasing availability of labor-saving devices from the vacuum cleaner to the washing machine and a preference for smaller homes saved many married women from hours of housework. The lives of many Americans were changing at a rapid pace. The 1920 census revealed that, for the first time, more Americans lived in urban areas than in the countryside. One of the defining features of the period was the sense of conflict between provincialism and modernity. Rural and urban America presented a stark contrast. Cities grew and prospered while the agricultural sector suffered. The Great War had been a prosperous time for American farmers, but peace and the recovery of European powers brought the good times to an end. Demand and food prices fell sharply in the 1920s, and with rising production costs, by 1922, many farmers had seen their incomes effectively cut in half. Much worse would follow in the aftermath of the Wall Street crash. The economic prosperity of the 1920s did not reach the countryside. In the cities, there was a growing appetite for consumer goods and spectacular public events. Charles Lindbergh's daring solo flight across the Atlantic from Long Island to Paris in 1927 made him a national hero. The first radio station with regular programming was established in Pittsburgh in 1920. And by the winter of 1921, virtually every middle-class American home had a set installed. The new medium allowed the broadcast of music, church sermons, and sporting events across the nation. The first live sporting event broadcast was the July 1921 heavyweight title fight between Jack Dempsey and Georges Carpentier. The event was a sensation. 80,000 gathered to watch the event in Jersey City, while another 300,000 listeners followed the blow-by-blow accounts of the ringside announcers. Car ownership increased substantially in the 1920s, from around 7 million in 1920 to a little over 23 million by 1929. Ford released the Model A, a successor to the popular Model T, to great fanfare in December 1927. The company had spent over $1 million on newspaper adverts alone in the run-up to its release. Young people particularly enjoyed the newfound freedom of being able to escape from their hometowns for a night, much to the chagrin of their parents. Books and magazines from the 1920s embraced a more open and honest outlook on life, which defied censorship and societal taboos. The Lost Generation was the name given to a cohort of American writers who were left disillusioned and cynical over the experience of the First World War. The group, which includes Hemingway, T.S. Eliot, and F. Scott Fitzgerald, explored the feelings of aimlessness and hopelessness in their work. In 1925, Fitzgerald wrote one of the most famous novels of the decade, The Great Gatsby. The novel details the decadence and glamour of the time, but writes of how unfulfilling the lifestyle ultimately was. It was not only the writers and artists who challenged the existing order. A teacher from Tennessee set out to test the law in 1925. The Butler Act was a provision that prohibited the teaching of evolution in public schools in Tennessee. With the support of the ACLU, John T. Scopes agreed to violate the law to test its constitutionality. The trial garnered national attention as Scopes was ultimately found guilty and fined $100. The conviction was eventually overturned by the Supreme Court on a technicality. The trial was symptomatic of the split between traditional and modern values in the United States at the time. There was a growing fascination with science and technology among Americans. While some yearned for a return to simpler times, many others looked forward to the next big thing. A series of fads swept across the country in the 20s, which included self-help books, mahjong, and crossword puzzles. The great increase in spending on consumer goods was facilitated by easy access to credit, which saw the overall wealth of the country double between 1920 and 1929. With his first full term almost at an end in 1927, Calvin Coolidge responded to speculation over his 1928 plans with a characteristically taciturn statement to the press. "I choose not to run for president in 1928. Coolidge was succeeded by Herbert Hoover, who easily defeated the Democratic candidate Al Smith in 1928. As president, Hoover followed the example of Harding and Coolidge in opposing regulation of business and the stock market. He began his presidency optimistic that the prosperity of the past decade would continue into the 30s. Signs of the financial catastrophe to come were present long before the crash, but few could have foreseen just how devastating the fall to come would ultimately be. The 20s atmosphere of living for the moment was especially present on the investing habits of Wall Street. The practice of buying stock on credit became so common that by the late 20s, a vast majority of stocks were purchased with borrowed money. This led to one of the longest bull markets in American history, and investors from all walks of life looked to get in on the action. Of course, this growth was completely unsustainable, and some experts warned of a major recession to come as early as February 1928, but the speculation only increased and reached feverish levels by the summer. Short downturns in June 1928 and February 1929 led to greater growth, and it was widely believed that any recession would be short-lived and would lead to even greater returns. Believing that the experts were crying wolf, Americans poured millions into the stock market. The crash came in October. The worst day of all was Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929. Losses led to a flood of panic selling, and months of gains were lost in a matter of hours. The United States entered the Great Depression, while the economic downturn in Europe helped to fuel the rise of extremist movements in the 1930s. As you can see, this decade was one of contrasts. It was a time of political conservatism and cultural experimentation. New forms of art, music, and literature flourished, while older traditions fell by the wayside. Important strides forward in women's liberation were checked by the resurgence of hate groups and widespread anti-Semitism. Just as the aftermath of the Great War would shape the course of the 1920s, the Wall Street crash determined the direction of the 1930s. One of the bleakest chapters in the history of the world was about to unfold, but that's a topic for another video. I hope this overview was helpful. Thanks for watching, and happy studying.